Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this session. My name is Omar Halabi, and this webinar is about writing an effective resume. Now, why is writing an effective resume important? Well, your resume is basically your gateway to your next opportunity. It's basically the interface between you and your next role, whether that resume is going to get passed to a recruiter or the hiring manager or someone in the decision-making chain with respect to the opportunity. So having a resume that's effective is super important. Most of the statistics show that a resume, typically someone, whether it's the recruiter or the hiring manager, may be looking at it for maybe 15 to 20 seconds. And so being able to convey your key messages very concisely and precisely is important to gain the right attention from the reader to hook them to read the rest of your experience and subsequently, hopefully, invite you over for a phone screen or interview or whatever the next step may be. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Omar Halabi. I've been a tech leader for the last 20 years, currently director of technology at Amazon Payment Services. I'm based in Dubai. And I listed my background here just by means of telling you, like, I've reviewed a lot of resumes, probably thousands of resumes, made hundreds of, hiring decisions across, different job families, different geographies. So I'm about to share with you here is my combined experience, having done all of that and what things I've seen work effectively and not. Again, there's no, in some sense, right or wrong opinion here. I'm talking basis the extensive experience that I have within Amazon. I'm also what's known as a bar raiser. So I'm trained to basically withhold the Amazon hiring bar as well. So let's jump right in. So a few general comments before we get into, let's say, section by section in terms of dissecting the resume. A few things in terms of format and as well as font and style is to really keep it simple. This is not the time and place to show extensive creativity unless you're in very unique, let's say, domain or role around like creative production or something like that. But for the most of us, keep it as simple as possible. Use the simplest of templates just to make it easy to convey the information and not distract the reader in that respect. So don't spend too much time on the formatting. There are tons of, really simple, good templates out there that exist. So just leverage an existing template and stick to basic, font and style as it relates to that. Remember, a lot of the times these resumes get uploaded into a system. So you also want basically the systems to recognize a lot of this data, to auto-populate it, etc., particularly when you're submitting referrals or applications online. In terms of length, a common question I get a lot is how long should my, let's say, resume be? My recommendation is that if you're a relatively fresh starter in your career, typically one page is good enough. It's more than enough to showcase your experience. If you're more experienced, let's say you have several years plus under your belt, then 2 pages is usually the right length. Sometimes it can go to 3 if you're really, really experienced, but I would say no more than 3 pages. I think people will stop reading that at some point. Again, unless in very specific cases, like you're applying for an academic research position or something like that, where sometimes these CVs could be a lot longer. And then again, in terms of language, keep it simple. This is not the time to pull out all the different, let's say, complex vocabulary that you may have. Remember, people reading this resume, they may be very experienced in the area you're applying for, they may not. So you want to keep things as simple as possible. So then we move on. The first section typically in a resume, some people call it summary, some people call it objective, but you really can think about it as your elevator pitch. This is really your executive summary, summarizing who you are as a profile and highlighting the key experience that you bring. I would say this is probably the most important part of your resume. The reason for that is this is typically the only thing that's read prior to making a decision of whether to move on to read the rest or to basically pass your resume and move on to the next one. And so it's super important for this to be captivating in terms of really hooking the reader in terms of wanting to know more about this profile as it relates to the open position or the role that is there and that is open. And so you want to position your profile along your experience, but also along the lines of the role that you're applying for. This is also particularly important when, let's say, your job role or title or whatever else in your current role may not exactly tie to the position that you're applying for. This is your opportunity to explain your profile to showcase that, hey, while your title may be slightly different, it means the same thing, and you are a suitable candidate for the job. Again, don't go to the other extreme where you try to squeeze everything that you have in this section. Think of this as it really needs to give an executive sort of summary flavor to what your experience is, and then of course all the secondary level of detail will be in your resume afterwards. So that's kind of on this section. I would say this is a section that you would want to spend a disproportionate amount of time getting right, because as I said, it's usually the let's say the decision maker in terms of moving on or not. So it's time well spent to do that there. I just gave some example and I quoted the source here. This is really a candidate that is showcasing that their profile is positioned for an online marketing role. They showcase their background in terms of having an MBA and working with some of these key technologies and summarizing overall experience level. And this really helps the person, the recruiter, get a 30,000 foot level view of this candidate. So for example, if I'm a recruiter and I'm looking for somebody who has, like, let's say 15 years of experience, then I know that this is probably not the right fit for me and I can just stop there and not move on. But if it's somebody that, let's say, relatively early on in their career with a few years of experience under the belt, then they're a great fit, especially if I'm looking also for somebody who has that specific expertise and who's played a role in this kind of company before. And remember that a lot of the keywords that you will use here are going to be based on, let's say, the job description or the role description that you're shooting for. So one litmus test I always like to do is, by the time you write this and you're applying for a specific role, take this section, take the job description, and think of yourself, even if you didn't know as much in that area as you do, if somebody reads those two artifacts, would they be able to make at least a first impression to say that this looks like a good match in that respect? Always frame it in terms of what's in it for the person reading the resume. This is not just about you telling them about yourself. Ultimately, it's more about what you can do for them and why they should be interested in calling you for an interview in that respect. Moving on, the next section typically in your resume is what we call the experience section. This is arguably, after the summary and the objective, the second most important section in your resume. So this is what you've done in terms of experience, what you've learned, etc. So a few key tips that I give here. The first one is obviously list your roles in what we call reverse chronology, which means listing out the current role that you have or the last role that you had first, and then work backwards till you reach either the first role, or if you've become too experienced, maybe it's 3 or 4 roles that the latest that you've had. Make sure that you introduce the company, unless the company is like super well known. And so remember that you may be applying for a role in a different industry, sometimes in a different country, etc. So don't assume that the person reading this may know the company that you're talking about. And why it's important is because this will help the reader appreciate the scope of the role in the company that you're dealing with there. For example, is it a local company? Does it have international presence? Does it operate at a medium scale and enterprise scale? So all these are good context for the reader to have. Again, not more than 1 or 2 lines is sufficient there. Clarifying the role. At times the role is very self-evident. So for example, you may say, hey, I'm a software development engineer. More or less at any company, software development engineers relatively work within similar responsibilities, but there are a vast majority of roles where it's very specific to the company in terms of what the scope of the role is and what it actually means. So make sure that you also spend maybe a line or two just explaining what does that role mean in the context of your company there. And then the fourth point I have here is to highlight any progression, because progression is definitely a good sign. It means you're growing, the company is investing in you. These are all good signs. And so if you were, for example, holding a specific role and then you were promoted, whether, let's say, horizontally or vertically into another role, showcase that. So you may break out the section and says, this was my title or my responsibility then, and then this is my responsibility now. And you can say something like, promoted or elevated or whatever else to this role as well. Again, this is usually one of the best signs in terms of somebody making progress in their career. And I just picked up an example from my own resume just for illustration. So again, it highlights basically the companies, the locations, the dates. It gives a line or two about the company, because unless you're in that geography and you're in that industry, you've probably never heard of this company before. So it tells you like, hey, this is a substantially large company and business that we're dealing with, both in terms of the company size, the size of the customer base that it serves, etc. And then I showcase, the different roles that I had to showcase the progression that I talked about. And within each one of them, I give a line or two about what does this mean? Because, to give an example, like while I say I was a IT manager, digital marketing, somebody reading this may think, like, for example, I was doing things related to what normally people associate with digital marketing, whether it's social media campaigns and things like that. But here in this context, it's actually very different. And so taking the time to explain that, I think is very helpful and relevant as others read it. Another important thing when it comes to experience that I often see missed is basically making sure that as you write about your experience, that you're basically covering the 3 elements of scope, complexity, and impact. So think about scope as, let's say, the breadth or the remit of the role in terms of how many different responsibilities that you have. And then think of complexity as an indication of the level of challenge that you have in doing these responsibilities. And so, for example, you may be building something from scratch or having to set up the infrastructure because it didn't exist, or there were no prior expertise for what you're doing within the company. So all of these elements make what you're doing more complex in the context that you're doing that. And those are all things that you want to convey, because otherwise the person reading your resume it would be difficult for them to properly appreciate the experience that you're bringing, because they may assume, for example, maybe at the company where they're at the moment, those things are maybe done by somebody else or already solved for, etc. And then pretty much the most important thing really is impact, because ultimately we all want to know that individuals are delivering results for their companies and for their customers. So make sure that you're focusing on impact. And when we talk about impact, a lot of times, a pitfall that I see is where people focus on what I call outputs, which means something like I generated, let's say, 10 reports. That's an output. But really what matters when it comes to impact is what I call the outcome. So you'll hear me say sometimes like say outcomes versus outputs, right? Which is, okay, great, you generated 10 reports, but is anybody using these reports? What are they using them for? How are they helping the business? How are they helping customers? Those are all very important aspects of essentially what you do and what you deliver. And again, the impact, especially as you grow in seniority, if you think about your impact in terms of like concentric circles, with the smallest circle being your team, then your organization, then the whole company, then even outward focus towards customers, partners, stakeholders, etc. Obviously, as you gain more seniority, the expectation is you're touching a much broader impact. So make sure you're very clear on what kind of impacts your experience has generated as you're able to do that. So again, I picked up an example from my own resume. A couple of things that I wanted to highlight is basically when we talk about essentially the scope, right? We talk about things like, hey, the scope of this project was across 35 different teams. It included like an end-to-end implementation of a generation management system. It included things like procuring the infrastructure and deploying control centers over 9 different physical sites. So these all help you appreciate the scale and the magnitude of the complexity of the project that's there. And when we talk about complexity, again, similar elements to the scope, it helps show you that, hey, how many teams this person had to work with. For example, some of the elements on redundancy and having segregated infrastructure and meeting compliance requirements and stringent security requirements. These are all things that indicate complexity in terms of this person that had to manage there. And obviously, in terms of impact, there's impact on the financials from a business standpoint. There's impact on like the quality in terms of no major defects, etc. And then in terms of the revenue that this has generated for the organization and the recognition that it also received, kind of re-emphasizing that same theme. So the next one essentially on the list, usually after experience, is typically education. So with education, obviously you want to indicate what institution that you attended. And again, especially important for people applying for roles out of country, is be clear that which country this institution is in, and a little bit of description, because again, if you're applying in a different country, then the institution you're a part of may not be known, which could be important. Indicate your degree, and if you have a specialization, make sure you mention that. This is especially true when the degree that you have, at least the title of it, is broad. So like a Bachelor of Science, but it's like a Bachelor of Science in what? Because it could be anything from physics to chemistry to perhaps computer science or whatever, and that matters here in this context. Make sure you indicate the year of graduation. Obviously, these can be during work because you may be doing like a part-time degree, and they may be disconnected because you may have done, like, let's say, an undergrad degree, went to work, and then came back for a master's degree or whatever else there. And then I would say that projects and sort of extracurricular activities, to the extent that they're relevant for the role, I would say include them, particularly if you're a relatively fresh graduate without a lot of experience, because in some ways this is a way for you to showcase that you're able, you've worked on projects and you're able to deliver. And then, of course, if you're going into more of an academic type role, whatever you've done here could be very relevant. Things like publications, etc., become very relevant here as well. So again, here's an example, from my own degree, just saying like, hey, it's a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, the university, its location, and then the year I graduated. And again, as I've had a number of years of experience, that's pretty much all you need to know as it relates to education. There may not be much more to say there in that aspect. So those were what I would say the fundamental blocks of every resume, which are the profile summary at the top, the experience, then the education section. Now there's a bit of, let's call them miscellaneous or extras that are there. So what are some of these extras? These could be anything from, let's say, public speaking engagements, certifications that you've had, volunteering experience, etc. My guidance generally there is only include them if they're relevant to the experience and the role that you're applying for there. And just be clear on why it's important and what's the relevancy for what you're applying it for. Otherwise, I would rather remove it than to include it if it doesn't add value in that respect, just going by keeping things concise and keeping them simple in that respect. So that would be essentially what I would suggest there for those. So in this case, for example, if I'm applying for, let's say, an IT operation or IT management type of role, in this case, like if you have an IT service management certification, it's very valuable for the role to showcase your understanding of frameworks and best practices as they relate to how you manage IT services in that respect. So again, once you've put together your resume, a few things that I always recommend is number one is, and I mentioned this before already, cross-checking against job posts is very important. You want to make sure that as you line up your resume and you line up the job posts, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of the experience, the keywords that are used, etc. So make sure that, again, there's a high level of resonance, just so that if somebody's scanning it, within 15, 20, 30 seconds, they're really able to see that this, you're a good fit for a role that you believe you're suitable for, and that there's a high match between the two. I always recommend having your resume reviewed by someone else, at least if not a professional, like a friend or just a fresh pair of eyes, because at some point, as we edit a document over and over again, we just become completely blind to seeing anything that may be glaring. Obviously, you want to run things like spell check, grammar check, etc. And these days, there are so many tools that in some ways it's inexcusable to have mistakes in your resume. Of course, you can opt for professional service to both help you write it or proofread it or or review it for you. But just make sure that somebody's taken a look at it, because again, a lot of the times we're so attached to what we're doing that we don't recognize things that may be glaring, and we're so familiar with what we do. So it's hard for us to really assess things objectively, whereas somebody else that's reading it that may not be as familiar can provide a more reliable view of an opinion of what's happening there. So those are, that's pretty much it. I think one of the questions I always get here is generally around, well, does that mean I basically need to create let's say a resume for every job that I apply to? And generally my answer is that, anchor let's say the profile or the type of roles that you're trying to apply for. And generally these should not be more than, let's say, maybe 2 to 4. And make sure that you have, let's say, variations of your resume. So it's not like you're going to rewrite your entire resume, but at least the positioning of the profile section and maybe tweaking some of the experiences to make it more relevant for that specific role type. And so you could have like 2 or 3 varieties of your resumes that you would use depending on the role. But definitely recommend to make sure that as you read the profile, there's a strong resonance with the job post. Otherwise, like maybe over 95% chance that your resume will be skimmed over in that regards there. So that's essentially brings me to kind of the end, at least of the prepared material in terms of some of the things that I've talked about. I've included some of my contact details, and we'll share this slide deck afterwards in terms of my email, my website, and my LinkedIn. I do post daily on the topics of leadership development and career growth. So if you're interested in learning about these topics and whatnot, I definitely recommend following me on LinkedIn, as well as visiting my website, specifically on effective resume. I have created recently a 45-point checklist, which is a document that has basically 45 things that you should check in your resume after you write it, just to make sure that it falls in line with a lot of the best practices and the guidances that I've shared here, that I'm happy to share with anyone. It's available on my website if it's of interest. Yeah, with that, just wanted to thank you for attending. And at this point, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah.